I'm going to offer now a first reading, which is a poem by Karen Anway Lee, that it's called Songs of Comfort. And it's a poem that reveals it's got a little bit of a surprise that it reveals gradually. But it's a poem of a wonderful moment of generosity and of finding gratitude in small moments. And this is what it says. The friendly cellist with a big heart, a longtime resident of a neighboring town where I grew up, who received bouquets from the flower shop where I trimmed roses, said his favorite thing to do after returning from a trip was grocery shopping, savoring the essentials of small life away from the airports and applause, buying milk, fruit, like blessings of solace, bread, tea, local honey in a jar, slow, lovely as sarabands, those songs without words aired in isolation through the pandemic. After his dose, Yo-Yo Ma plays an impromptu concert for others waiting in the 15-minute interval after the shots to monitor allergic reactions. Masked, he lifts his cello out of its case, perhaps his favorite one named Petunia, then tightens the horsehair bow adroitly. The cello, with its mellow notes of melancholy mingled with hope, fills the hall like the light at the end of the tunnel, the residents say. Light at the end of the tunnel. I know it must be true because I would never put this trite sentence in a poem otherwise. God is waiting for us to pay attention. God is waiting in the light. Yo-Yo Ma offering an impromptu concert after being vaccinated. The assigned Bible reading for this morning is a familiar story. I'm sure it will sound familiar once I get into it. It comes from John chapter 6. I'm not reading the entirety of what's assigned because the assigned lesson is 2 stories put together, and this one seems enough. After this, it starts us in the middle of what's going on. So we'll just know that it's after what just happened. After this, Jesus went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, also called the Sea of Tiberias. A large crowd kept following him because they saw the signs that he was doing for the sick people. Jesus went up the mountain and sat down there with his disciples, which is the teaching posture in the ancient world. Now, the Passover, the festival of the Jewish people, was near. When Jesus looked up and saw a large crowd coming towards him, he said to Philip, the disciple, "Where are we going to buy bread for all these people to eat?" He said this to test him because he already knew what he was going to do. Philip answered, 6 months' wages would not buy enough bread for each of them to get just a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There's a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what are they among so many people?" Jesus said, "Make the people sit down." There's a great deal of grass in the place, so they sat down, about 5,000 of them in all. Jesus took the loaves. When he'd given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated. Same with the fish, as much as they wanted. When they were satisfied, he told his disciples, "Gather up the fragments left over so that nothing will be lost." So they gathered them, and from the fragments of those 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten, they filled 12 baskets. When the people saw the sign that he had done, they began to say, "This is indeed the prophet who is to come into the world." When Jesus realized that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, he withdrew again to the mountain by himself. And this is the word of God. I wonder what sort of reactions that story generates for anyone. And you can, if you want, you can take yourselves off mute to say. The reactions might be, oh, I've heard this at least once a year, every year of my life. Maybe it takes me back to my childhood. Maybe it awakens some deep lesson for me. I'm curious to hear what you respond to in this reading. If you want to say anything, you can just take yourself off mute. If you don't want to say anything, that's okay too. Maybe it's percolating, in which case there will be a moment, you'll be able to still speak. I want to maybe ask another question about memories of times when you knew that you belonged somewhere. Or can you call up a memory of being made to feel like you belonged, or feeling like you were being taken care of? I think we all got an excellent visual just a little minute ago about creating a situation where someone feels very cared for. Zinnia there looking up at Juniper. Becky in the chat, thank you. You wonder about miracles today. Oh, thank you. That's a lively question when we read these stories, isn't it? Because miracles in the ancient world maybe they meant something different, maybe they mean something similar to us. It's always a tricky proposition for us who are talking to each other over computers and the powerful computers we keep in our pockets everywhere. Yeah, but the miracle stories, they raise some lively and interesting possibilities for us. Anything else? All right. Well, I invite you to, if you can call not only into your mind, but recall in your body the feeling of being held, being cared for, the feeling of belonging. I think that those feelings are key to this story. That whatever we think about miracles, whatever they might mean for us today, if we can be in touch with these feelings of wonder, of belonging, of risk-taking, of community, then this story is taking us into the world it wants to create. This story, the feeding of the 5,000, it is the only miracle story that shows up in all four of the Gospels. The only one that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all hold in common. Every other miracle story of Jesus, at least one of the gospel writers left it out of their account. But there's something about this one that circulated generally in the storytelling about Jesus in those early Jesus movements that gave birth to the Gospels, that this one was told through all four of the canonical Gospels that we have. But John has some details that are unique to his account. Some of them are because he's got a theological axe that he wants to grind, making sure that we, the readers, understand how important and exalted and elevated Jesus is. So in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus has the disciples distribute the food to the masses. But John puts that control in Jesus's hands himself. He suggests that Jesus distributes the food to everyone who's seated, which I don't know if that means that anyone who wasn't seated didn't get some, or it just was an exceptionally long lunch because Jesus went to all 5,000 people individually. But in all four of the Gospels, this story echoes the Hebrew story of the prophet Elisha, who fed a crowd during a time of famine. with only 20 loaves of bread. The story is that someone came to the prophet, again, during famine, with 20 barley loaves, says, "Prophet, person of God, this is my offering for you. Please eat." And Elisha said, "Oh, I don't need this. Give it to the people." "But there's only 20 loaves here. This is not going to help the people." "No, give it to the people." And all the people ate from just those 20 loaves. So clear echo here. But John is the only one of the four Gospels who sets this story during the approach of the Passover feast. So Jesus is not in Jerusalem, he's outside of Jerusalem, goes up on a mountain, which is an important place to give a message. But during Passover, this is the time when pilgrims should have been flocking to Jerusalem for the festival. Instead, they're coming out to find Jesus in the mountains. So John's symbolism is pretty clear that he's pointing towards the last guy who was connected with Passover and important messages from mountains, and that's Moses. So he's saying, look at Jesus. You'll see Elisha, you'll see Moses, you'll see all this wrapped up in this guy. So that's John's theological axe to grind that he's putting into the story. But some of the details that he shares they're more earthbound. They add a bit of realism, a bit of humanity. The other Gospels just say that the disciples had the loaves and the fishes, or that somehow they were able to obtain them. No real attention to how. Only John gives us the image of a young person offering up their lunch for other people to share. This is my gift. I don't know what you can do with it, but this is what I will offer for everyone. And only John adds that they were barley loaves and dried fish, not nice, freshly cooked fish, but dried fish. This was the food of peasants for all of the people in the story. Whatever their backgrounds, they were nourished by a shared and simple feast that drew them together instead of reinforcing their hierarchies. That's what John adds. There's also another funny detail that he adds that maybe sits in some tension with how hard he's working to make sure we know how high Jesus should be exalted. And it's that after everyone had their fill of the barley loaves and the dried fish, they got super excited and wanted to force Jesus to become their king. Now, it's true that the Bible uses some royal language and imagery. The Hebrew Bible certainly talks about God as a heavenly ruler. And some of the New Testament writings exalt Jesus, use some kingly imagery for Jesus, like the spiritual powers and all of creation bowing down to show their reverence. It makes sense. This was a world that knew empire and knew kingship very intimately. Their experiences with emperors and with kings were not all that great. Wealth trickled upward, if you can imagine that. Abuse was all too common. And this was even true of the good ones. Oddly enough, another one of today's assigned Bible readings is the story of David and Bathsheba. David being the king that the Hebrew scriptures call a man after God's own heart. And yet this story of David and Bathsheba, I will be delicate because of our mixed audience, our young audience here. But this is the story of a man in power using his power to assault someone. And it results in a pregnancy. And this is followed not by him taking responsibility, but rather scheming to make sure that Bathsheba's husband would die in battle. And this was the model of the good king that Israel knew. So it makes a certain kind of sense that the writers of the New Testament would position Jesus as a ruler who is over and above all of the other wretched and abusive rulers in the world. But here's the thing. In this story, when the people try to make Jesus their king, He flees from them. Now, the translations often say something very calm, like withdrew from them and went to the mountains. But the term is fled. He literally hightailed it into the mountains to get away from the adoring crowd because he knew that they felt full and they felt content. They felt the wonder and the glow and the beautiful sense of community that a shared meal can generate. They wanted that sense in their bodies of being held together and cared for. They wanted it to continue, and they wanted him to be the one who would make it continue. But that wasn't his aim. He wasn't running a campaign for emperor. He wasn't the vending machine of miracles. The miracle stories of the Bible, we'll say most of the miracle stories, because the second one that's part of this story is Jesus walking on water to reach his disciples out on the sea. But most of the healing stories, the feeding stories, the healing stories in particular, which is most of the miracle stories, they demonstrate spiritual power, but they also offered ways of creating community and of restoring people to fullness in community. So maybe we noticed that even though John tells the story with all the focus on Jesus, Jesus goes into hiding in John's own story. And maybe we noticed that what made this whole story possible in the first place is that a young person offered what they had, offered their own gifts, so that the whole community could be joined together and built up. And that is what Jesus used. So this is a story about risk, about generosity, about mutual care, about creating a community of belonging. It didn't require a king. It required a response. Something I've been sitting with this week as I sat with this story is an essay from Carrie L. Day, who teaches theology and African-American religion at Princeton Theological Seminary. From 2016 to 2018, she was on a task force that performed a historical audit to report on how the school benefited from the slavery economy, and then to start a conversation on what reparations would look like and how they could be implemented. In this essay that I was holding on to this week, she reflects on that process and on its aftermath. One of the things she talks about is a town hall event that was meant to let students address the task force and the seminary trustees about the audit and the demand for reparations. As often happens with these sorts of conversations, it got a little tense, in part because the representatives of institutions weigh their words carefully because they know they're not just speaking for themselves, but for the institution, and that can make them seem insincere. But one of the moments that Day describes is of a young white woman who seemed to be having a deep awakening about the way that history's racism remains embedded in the present. So she stood at the microphone. She named that the academic funding she receives as a Presbyterian student of a Presbyterian seminary was very generous. And she talked to the administration. She addressed the administration and said that she would be willing for some of her funding to be redistributed to Black students because they bear student loan debt burdens disproportionately. Day writes about this, being clear that she's not trying to turn this student into the hero of her story. And she notices and describes how several Black students spoke with her afterward to say how shocked they were by this. One in particular, she said, talked with her about how he generally had trouble trusting white students. And that makes all kinds of sense because saying the right thing is a lot easier than doing the right thing. And doing the right thing costs more, which often the right words stop before the costs begin. There are plenty of examples of white people saying the right things, but not following up. This student's comments and her conviction moved something in him, and he decided to offer something as well, which was the vulnerability to trust. So he sought her out after the town hall meeting, started a conversation with her. A big risk on his behalf. Gifts exchanged, community created, loaves and fishes. That, I think, is the story. The story's question: what do you have to offer? What do you need to receive? This isn't a story of something being created out of nothing. It's not a story about Jesus being forced into the role of the all-providing king. It's a story of gifts offered and community created, of bread and dried fish that made for a feast, of giving and receiving, of conviction, vulnerability, and trust. It's not a one and done miracle. It's an invitation. This is God's good news. Amen.